Okay, this is poem number 1, Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes, also sometimes referred to as Harlem, because he actually published it under both titles in different publications. So first I'll read the poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Okay, so in this poem, as you can tell, Langston Hughes is talking about one primary question. What happens if a dream has to be put off or in some way delayed, or, for some reason you can't do it? You have to remember that Langston Hughes was writing during Harlem Renaissance, so 1920s, as an African American. I'm sure he was facing all kinds of things with Jim Crow laws and all of that. And so you see that come through in his poetry, not just in this one, but in other poems that he does as well. So you have to keep that in mind whenever he's talking about this dream and the fact that it's been deferred. It has to be put off. So this is the primary question, okay? And so then he goes through and doesn't really answer it, but gives a series of questions that are actually as similes, where he proposes, like, maybe this is what happens. So in the first one he says, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Well, obviously, with the fact that it says like, we know that's going to be a simile, right? And so, what is he really asking there? Think about a raisin. You know what a raisin is. A raisin is like a grape that is shriveled up and been dried, right? So, how could a dream dry up, right? If you think about it, maybe it's something you keep having to put off. It's something you wanted to do. Maybe it's a college you wanted to go to, a career you wanted to attempt. Maybe you wanted to play college or professional ball. Something that just eventually, as you get older and you keep having to put it off and it keeps not working out, it just kind of eventually dries up to the point where, maybe there's not a whole lot left there. Okay? So then the second one he asks is a much more vivid image. Does it fester like a sore and then run? Okay. Not a pleasant image. Hopefully you're not eating right now. To fester means to basically rot or get infected, and form pus. And so think about a sore that fills with pus and then runs. Okay, not pleasant at all. Okay, so in what way could a dream do that and not be pleasant? Well, if you think of it as an infection, maybe this dream could sort of infect other parts of your life. So if there's something you really wanted to do and were not able to, would the disappointment of that run and infect into other aspects of your life and maybe lead you to be less contented with whatever you did have? Okay? And obviously, once again, we do see that we've got like there, so this is, of course, a simile as well. Okay? On the third one, I'll change colors again. On the third one, does it stink like rotten meat? Okay, so the way I always describe that is, imagine that today at school we grilled steaks and they smelled amazing. But then imagine we left them here. And when you come back after spring break, they're still sitting here. Not going to be very appetizing, right? So in that case, you can think of the dream as something that was initially, at the beginning, very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's something that you really, really wanted. It was very desirable. But as time went on, not only did you no longer desire it, it even became almost disgusting to you. Maybe because you couldn't have it. So think about how a dream could do that. Maybe you always wanted to be a doctor, let's say, and then so many things got in your way for, whatever it might be, that eventually the idea of even trying to attempt that disgusted you. You don't even want to think about it. If a relative brought up, like, oh, I thought you wanted to be a doctor, you would not be pleased at all. Okay? So then, and once again, of course, we do have the like. So then, on the next one, number 4, he says, or does it crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? So, again, we've got the simile. What I think of for this one is, imagine if we had brought in Krispy Kreme donuts. And you know, if they're really fresh, like they've just come off the assembly line, and the glaze is still really clear, you know, you can see through it. They're so good. But let's say, you know, maybe we close the box up. It doesn't get gross or anything, but we let it sit on the kitchen counter for 2 days. The glaze is not going to be see-through anymore. It's going to have crusted over because of the sugar. You know what I'm talking about? It's kind of a more opaque, still good, still desirable, okay? So, same thing with the dream. Maybe it's something that you do still desire even after all of these years. You know, it's still something that you want, okay? And you could see how a dream could be like that too. Now, I think it's important that there's actually a space here. Langston Hughes is not working with traditional stanzas where you might have 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines, but he does break up the poem. He starts out, obviously, with just the 1 line, which is the initial question, and then you've got a series of questions about what might happen to that dream. Then you have a break, and so I think that break is important. So he sets off the next one all by itself. And notice that this one is not a question. It is still a simile. It does still have like, but it's not a question. It's more a suggestion. He says, maybe it just sags like a heavy load. And I think we're all familiar with that simile, with that image there of something just really weighing you down. A lot of you probably had that today as you were leaving school with all of your books and stuff in your backpack. You probably had lots of things just sort of really weighing you down, you know. And so think about, how could a dream weigh you down? Well, you know, if it's something that you always wanted, you always promised yourself you would do, maybe you had told relatives that was something you were going to do, and as the years go by, and that dream gets further and further away, it almost becomes like a weight that you're carrying around, you know, that disappointment of something you never got to do, okay? And then the final line is not a simile, it is still a question, but it's simply, or does it explode? Now, anytime a poet is being, or very, when they're really thinking about how they're arranging the lines on the page, you have to pay attention to that. And in an explication of the poem, you would have to talk about why the poet did that. So we've already talked about why we've got that first question just out there on its own, because that's the whole point. And then you've got these series of questions, then you've got that one suggestion, and then this last is not a simile like all the other, and it's set off totally by itself. And what else do you notice about it? It's in italics, right? So not only do you have the very violent word explode, but it's also in italics. So you really are having multiple ways that the poet is expressing this sense of violence. Does it explode? Okay? And so how could a dream do that? Okay, well, look, again, let's think about the time period Hughes is writing in. You have, you know, probably a dream would have been put off not because the person wanted to or because they were lazy or something like that, but more so because they were unable to realize it. There were obstacles in their way. So how could that turn to violence? Well, you know, if you're not able to do something you really want to do, that can lead to frustration. And for people who, you know, are not able to handle that well, that frustration could possibly lead to violence. You know, it could go from someone who, you know, maybe wanted to be a doctor, they wanted to help people, but as they kept getting more and more obstacles put in their way, then eventually they turned to a life of crime. Or the violence might not even be to the outer world. The violence could be an inner violence. So it could be something like, you know, really talking horribly to yourself, or even, you know, possibly suicide. So that, you know, that frustration and that lack of realization of the dream actually leading to some sort of violent end. Okay? So that's basically what the poem's saying, that you've got all these different scenarios of what might happen to a dream that has been deferred, delayed, or put off, and possibly never realized. And I think it's important that he never answers the question. He gives us a lot of possible scenarios, but he doesn't actually give us the answer. And why do you think that would be? I think more than likely it's because there's no one answer. It's going to be different depending on the person and depending on their particular circumstance. Okay, so let's think about the speaker here. What do we know about the speaker? The speaker definitely seems to be very introspective. He seems to be someone who maybe has actually dealt with this type of scenario. Wouldn't you say? Like, he seems to be very familiar with it, or at least he's very good at empathizing with those who might have experienced a deferred dream. So, either a very empathetic speaker or a speaker who is possibly speaking from personal experience. And again, even though I know I have referenced Langston Hughes because he definitely did talk about writing from his own experience as an African American for the Harlem Renaissance, you cannot assume that the poet and the speaker are the same, okay? So always make a clear delineation whether you're talking about the poet or you're talking about the speaker. The poet decided to use similes. The poet decided how to arrange the lines on the page. The speaker is the one who's expressing the thoughts and emotions that come forth in the poem. It's the same difference or the same kind of thing as whenever you're talking about a author of a story or a novel and the narrator, which is the voice that's speaking to us. Okay? It's the exact same thing in poetry. Okay, so let's look at what possible literary elements we might be seeing here. Now, you've done the poetry terms diagnostic, so that's something you're going to want to have next to you as we go through these poems, so that you can kind of, if you need to, pause the video, look through and see what type of literary elements you think are particularly at play here. Explication is about not only figuring out what the poem means, but also what literary elements give it more depth. I described it today in one of the classes as, imagine you wrote a song and you sing the song a cappella. That could be very beautiful. We've heard beautiful a cappella songs, right? But then imagine that you add in other voices or instruments or even a full orchestra. That might make the experience of that song that much richer. So that's a little bit like what poets do when they're using literary elements to make the poem richer and to make it have more of an impact. Okay, so let's think about it from that perspective. Let me see if I can figure out how to erase here. Okay, so what do you think would be some of the main literary elements that the poet is using here? All right, hopefully somebody said simile, because pretty obviously he's using similes here. We've got a series of them. That's how he's sort of answering but not really answering the question about what happens to a dream deferred, is by a bunch of similes, and then, that's how he's getting us to picture what might happen. And with that in mind, that leads us to a second one, which would be imagery. Okay? You have some pretty vivid images here. Unfortunately, some of them are very gross, vivid images, like the sore that's running. Some of them are a little more pleasant, like crusting and sugaring over like a syrupy sweet. Some of the imagery you can almost feel, like, sagging like a heavy load. So imagery is often tied in with similes or other types of figurative language. It's something that really helps us to picture what the poet is describing. And those pictures that are brought up in our mind help to make the experience richer and help us to really sort of stop and focus on what the poet's saying. Okay? So those are two good ones. Another one, if you didn't already think of it, might be diction. And if you remember from your poetry terms, diction is simply a poet's choice of words. So I think the words that he's using here, if you really look at the poem, there are very few words in it. So the words that he chooses, you have to know he chose with great care. He's really delivering some very powerful images and handling some very big ideas in very few words. Okay? And so diction or choice of words is really going to be important. You don't normally see a poet write about a, sore festering and running in a poem. But I think he chooses those very jarring and actually disgusting words to really grab our attention and make us really think like, hey, how does this feel to these people who are having their dreams deferred? And then I think, of course, obviously, that last line where he's choosing not only the word explode, which is very violent, very graphic, but also the fact that he italicizes it. Because authors in just traditional short stories or novels or any type of writing, as well as poets, sometimes use italics as a means of emphasis. And so I think that's what he's doing here, of just the, or does it explode? And so you have that real emphasis there, that violent picture. I can almost see like a glass vase just like shattering into a million pieces. So you get that very violent sort of image coming through there. So again, all of these kind of tie into each other. The diction, the simile, the imagery, they all work together to give us the very sort of powerful experience of this particular poem, which is one of his famous ones. And Langston Hughes is well known for a lot of his different poetry. So, at this time, what you're going to need to do is take out your poetry analysis note-taking sheet. If you haven't already, you need to fill out the title of the poem, Dream Deferred or Harlem, and the poet is Langston Hughes. Now, please remember when you're writing poems, you're always going to want to make sure and put them in quotation marks, okay? Poems and short stories are both short. They go in quotation marks. Novels and plays are long. They're italicized. So we're going to put our poems in quotation marks. Make sure and add that. For your summary or paraphrase, you're just going to go through and write in your own words what this poem is about. I've given you that many lines because I expect you to fill that many lines. So give me a couple of sentences about what this poem is about and what it's actually saying. We talked about the speaker and the fact that the speaker is not the same as the poet. So give me that explanation of what we can tell about the speaker, why the speaker seems to be focusing on this particular issue. Literary elements, we went through our three main ones. We talked about simile, imagery, and diction. That's not to say those are the only ones that are used. Those are just some of the more prevalent ones that stood out to me. However, if you want to talk about some of the other ones that are listed there or that are listed in your poetry terms diagnostic, feel free to include those as well. And if you want to add in the comments, if you want to put something in the comments about another one that you see that you think is important, feel free to do that, okay? And then lastly, let's talk about tone. And I probably need to update a document or upload a document that I have because I have a document that sort of lists out a bunch of different tones. One of the things I want you to think about when you're thinking about tone of poem, it's kind of closely related to mood, but we really want to make sure that we're using our big girl and big boy words here, okay? You don't want to just say like happy, sad, depressed, okay? We want to kind of up our game a little bit and use some more thought-provoking words, okay? So maybe you could say something along the lines of the tone being very introspective, thinking about what's happening within. You could talk about the tone. The tone kind of switches in this poem. Tone can do that. So you can talk about how initially he's questioning, so he's just kind of questioning what happens. Then as it goes on, it almost seems weary when it talks about maybe it just sags like a heavy load. And then there's almost the tone of violence there at the end. So you can look at it that way. So I want to know what you think on those. Okay? So if you have any questions, or if you just want to add to the discussion, which I would love to see you do, please put that in the comments. Obviously, 20 minutes, I would have taken a lot longer in class. This would have lasted 50 minutes, but that's because I would have been able to include your ideas and asking you and getting responses. I did try to ask some questions throughout this video and give you a chance to maybe think a little bit, but I would love to see some of your reflections or your reactions to the poem in the comments. Okay? All right, that's it for Poem 1.